Well, we're Alex and I are about to talk about a book that I wrote over about the last 10 years called The Matter with Things, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. I was very fortunate that Alex approached me to talk some more about this, and we don't know how many sessions we will do, but we thought we'd start at any rate at the beginning of the book and discuss that and see where we go. Alex is a remarkable person. I'm personally in awe of his curriculum vitae. He is a theoretical physicist by training and has a couple of doctorates in physics, but he then retrained as a biologist and has worked on molecular biology and empirical zoology, but also on the theory of the theoretical aspects of biology, and is currently a professor at the Institute of Neurosciences in Alicante. And so he's a person with a remarkable breadth of interest and mind. And this is very nice for me because I find that I don't easily fit into any particular box. I'm generally interested in philosophy and have been since my younger years. I started out training in literature and the humanities, and then read medicine and became a psychiatrist with particular interest in the overlapping areas of psychiatry and neurology. So we need to see what happens, and I'm rather excited about it.
Well, thank you, Iain. It's a pleasure, really, and an honor to take part in this journey with you and to continue learning from you and with you as we cover your really, really remarkable book. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Before going on, I thought I might just give a brief overview of the introduction, which is something like 50 pages long. And it's that we're going to be discussing this morning, see how that goes. This particular book, The Matter with Things, arises from something I have been thinking over all my adult life, which is that there is something wrong with the way in which we're taught by popular science and many of the vox pop thinkers that are on the internet, the way we're taught to think about the world. And it's really part also of the way in which we educate the young. That is to liken it to a machine, a mechanism that has meaning only insofar as we put it into that world. But that when we come to look at the world, what we're really faced with is a collection of meaningless fragments of material stuff colliding with itself in ways that are to an extent predictable, but largely chaotic. And that this has no intrinsic beauty, complexity, structure, meaning, or direction. That has never seemed to me at all convincing. What I want to do in this book, or what I wanted to do in this book, was to explain why that vision of the world is to me not a convincing one, and to offer an alternative. So in the introduction, I ask us to reconsider some of our assumptions about the world. For example, that there is only matter, that matter is, naturally speaking, static until it is set in motion, that things are essentially atomistic until they're connected by us, that structures are in essence simple and then evolve from that simplicity into a greater complexity. I want to suggest that all these ideas are wrong, that we've inverted the evidence that we have before us. The evidence is, I will argue, that consciousness is every bit as real as matter, and that matter, in fact, is something that we know secondarily via consciousness, not the other way around. That the natural condition of things is not, as in the Newtonian universe, that of stasis, but is of motion, And what needs to be explained is not how things come to move, but how they ever come to be static. And I indeed argue that they are never truly static. I will argue that the world is not principally chaotic, nor that structures are in essence simple. These are products of the way we come to look at the world. In fact, there is no such thing as chaos. Randomness cannot really be any more than approximated. Everything has intrinsic structure. And what is simple in our eyes is simple not because it's somehow what existed before things became complex. Things have always been complex, but our way of looking at them can shear off most of the picture that surrounds what we're looking at, and thus make it appear simple and to obey simple linear laws, whereas in reality, nothing in the cosmos behaves in this mechanistic way. So those are some of the assumptions I set out with. And then I want to talk about the way in which the two hemispheres of the brain change the world that we look at. Because obviously, if I'm interested in examining what we can take as more real, more true than anything else, we need to take into account that how we attend to the world changes what is there for us to see. In an earlier book called The Master and His Emissary, I explained that the two hemispheres of the brain have evolved as all neural networks that we know going back 700 million years show an asymmetry. Why is there this asymmetry? It appears to be to do with the most basic problems of survival for any living creature. And that is how to pay attention to an isolated detail, something that is a morsel that we want to eat, prey that we want to catch, a twig that we want to pick up to build a nest, anything that we want to grab and get and manipulate, which requires a highly focused, targeted attention to a precisely visualized detail. And at the same time, not fall prey ourselves to predators that are in our surroundings. So at the same time as paying this very focused, detailed attention to one particular item, we need to be paying the exact opposite, a kind of broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention in which we can see what is unfolding around us. We can see dangers, we can see the presence of the creatures that form part of our social network, those that we want to nourish, those that we need to flee from. So that is a very, very essential aspect of being alive. And in the human case, it is eventuated in the two hemispheres of the brain, which are different in a number of respects, but all of these can be traced to the way in which they pay attention. If, as in the case of the left hemisphere, you pay this very narrow beam, highly focused, targeted attention to detail, then the world appears to be created out of a heap of fragments, little pieces here, there, and everywhere, that are isolated, atomistic, in themselves meaningless, sheared off from any context that might give them meaning, static, because this is the attention that fixes and freezes things so that you can get hold of them, and essentially inanimate. Whereas the right hemisphere, seeing continuity over time and continuity over space, sees a world in which everything is interconnected seamlessly, in which things are never fixed but constantly changing and flowing, in which context is of vital importance to understanding what it is that we're looking at, in which everything is charged with many layers of meaning, and which is essentially an animate world. One way of looking at this difference is that the left hemisphere sees something like a very simplified diagram that it recreates after the event of experience. So the right hemisphere is, as it were, experiencing the world. It is bringing the thing into being for us. And the left hemisphere is representing, in other words, literally after the fact of its being present, is making it present again, when it no longer truly is present, in the shape of a theory, a diagram, a schema, or a map. And this difference between the world in theory and as it is mapped by the left hemisphere, which sees everything in mechanical terms, is quite different from the living, vibrant world that the right hemisphere sees without making presumptions about its mechanical nature. Because I'm suggesting that attention changes the world, I need to clarify that I don't mean that we make up the world in a purely idealist way, that there is no real world at all, but it's just what the product of our mind produces. I'm not saying that, but I'm also not saying that there is just simply naively a world out there that is purely objective and has nothing of us in it, and that the way to understand it is to exclude our attention entirely from the process. That will produce certainly a version of the world, but a very remarkable one in which everything that makes it valuable to us has been taken out of the picture. Then I give some of the core ideas of the hemisphere hypothesis as I have developed it, some 20 perhaps differences that one can see between the ways in which the right and left hemisphere deliver the world, the nature of those differences, and I address some of the potential causes of confusion. So over the last decade or so, people have raised perfectly valid questions about what it is I'm saying, but which are misunderstandings of what I'm trying to convey, and so I address some of those. I also address the question of should we go beyond the facts. This is something that scientists sometimes say when one looks at scientific findings in a philosophical way, as though they had significance for us as human beings. There is no way they cannot have significance for us, and most great scientists have also seen that what we find in empirical science helps us shape the picture of the world. And what I want to do is to reintroduce philosophy to science and science to philosophy. They're natural companions. In fact, until probably 200 years ago, they would have been thought of as aspects of the same business of coming to understand what there is in the world. And I think that I can offer a way in which we can make progress in philosophy, because in following the argument that I lay out both in The Master and His Emissary and in The Matter with Things in more detail in the more recent book, one can see what the hallmarks, the characteristics are of the way in which the world seems to the left hemisphere and the way in which the world seems to the right hemisphere. And if it's possible to evaluate how reliable either of these visions is, we can then, for the first time, make some progress in philosophy. If there are two conflicting points of view, we don't just have to shrug our shoulders and say, well, some people say this and some people have said that. We can say, yes, this particular vision is typical of what happens when the left hemisphere gets hold of the world and tries to make sense of it. And this other picture is an attempt to convey what the right hemisphere sees there. Now, if, and that's of course a big if, which we will have to explore, if we can show that one of these visions, and spoiler alert, I'm going to suggest that this is the vision of the right hemisphere, sees more of what there is and is a more reliable witness for us to base our activities in the world, our experience of the world, our reaction to the world on, then we can make that step and identify where certain trains of thought are to be attributed to the right or the left hemisphere. And I think that's probably enough to say here, except perhaps to give a brief note about the structure of the book. So it's in 3 parts, although physically in 2 volumes. The first part of the book is neuropsychology, in which I aim to look at the ways in which we can get a hold on the world at all, the means or portals whereby the world comes to be experienced by us. And I take those to be things like attention, perception, which is not the same as attention, judgments formed on what we attend to and how we perceive it, the ways in which we grab hold of things and use them in the world, our emotional and social intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, and indeed our creativity. All these help to bring about the basic view of the world that we have to operate on. The second part of the book, as I've mentioned, is epistemology. I look at what are the ways open to us to take further the data that we have through those portals or means that I've just described. One of them is science. We can, in the practice of science, we can use our senses and our various intellectual and imaginative faculties to create a picture of the world that helps us understand it. Another would obviously be reason. A third, I suggest, would be intuition, and a fourth, imagination. And I look at each of those in part 2 of the book and suggest that, in fact, we cannot dispense with any of these, but need to bring them to bear in different ratios and in different ways on everything that we come to look at. And that, interestingly, in each case, the view of the right hemisphere is the one that gives most power to each of those paths to truth, toward truth, because of course we can't ever actually reach that truth in itself. And that takes me to part 3, which is the second physical volume of the book, which is metaphysics. When we apply what we found in parts 1 and 2 to the universe, what do we find? And this involves looking at the basic elements of the cosmos, things like time and space, matter and consciousness, but also things such as values and the sense of the sacred. So that is the outline of the book, and it's that I try to convey in this introductory part of the book. So Àlex, that's probably as much as I need to say at the moment, probably more than enough. And I'd like to hand over to you now, because I'm sure you've got comments and questions.
Sure. I mean, that's fantastic. And one can see there's so much to unpack. And that's the reason why we're doing this, actually, to have this conversation. So yours is obviously an ambitious task, and it's an important task. And you argue that it's also an urgent task. And as you also mentioned a minute ago, there are all these isms, right? Materialism, reductionism, representationalism. There are all this connection of isms that, in a way, well, you're fighting against, or even better, you're trying, as you said, to invert or correct kind of the hierarchy or the superiority they have on other ways of understanding the world. Now, a distinction that you make that I think it's really, really powerful, and that's what I would like to discuss now for a little time, is this distinction between apprehending and comprehending, as illustrating these radically different views of seeing the world. And one has to do with manipulation, of course, and the other one with understanding. And I think just from the words themselves and the roots of the works, it is very powerful, both as a summary and also as a root of the cause of all this preference for certain isms that you're saying pop thinkers present as if they were true, actually, which are, in my view, abstractions, and to confront these with experience and also avoiding the common distrust we have on experience. But I wanted to ask you about experience later, but maybe we could continue with apprehending and comprehending, because it's very useful to me.
Yes, thank you for drawing attention to that. I use the word apprehend in a specific sense, which is its original sense of grasping hold of something. And this comes from the Latin root ad and prehendere, to take hold, and ad, to go to it and take it. And this is the function, I suggest, from an evolutionary point of view of the left hemisphere. It enables us to manipulate the world. The right hemisphere, I suggest, comprehends, helps us understand the world. And that comes from a root in Latin meaning to take together. And that's really an important point, because an awful lot of what I'm talking about is what follows from whether you see things as a whole and only move to focus on a part taking into account that you're looking in an artificial way as part of a whole, and the other way of looking at it, which is you try and break it down into the smallest parts you can, understand those, and then build it back up from there. That is, of course, how we make a machine. And so it's the obvious way in which the part of the mind that grasps things and takes them apart wants to view the cosmos itself, which it didn't actually make, but imagines it is something like a machine that we could have constructed. So that's an effective difference. And as I say, a sort of soundbite would be the left hemisphere helps us apprehend or grasp and manipulate the world. The right helps us comprehend or understand it. And that distinction, as I say, is an ancient one going back at least 700 million years, and explains the otherwise baffling fact that the brain, a structure that is made to make connections, and its power exists only in the number of connections it can make, has an enormous divide down the middle. It's also asymmetrical. Why? And the band of tissues at the base of the brain, the corpus callosum, that connects those two aspects, is often inhibitory. A lot of the work it does is to tell the other hemisphere, keep out of this while I deal with it. That suggests that there are two potent ways of viewing the world that mustn't interfere with one another if they're each of them to work well to the end that they're designed to fulfill.
All right, I'll come back to apprehending and comprehending later, but since let's jump into the bihemispheric structure of the brain, because that's also the soil on which all these ideas will grow. And so we have these neurological facts that you've studied and put together in a remarkable way, because that seems to be sometimes far beyond what one person alone can hold in their mind. But there are these neurological facts that we will, of course, unpack. But then from here, you draw psychological implications, and as you said, even later, also metaphysical consequences, not just from the neurology, but also from physics and from philosophy itself. So maybe we could discuss a bit now, or as much as needed, what are these neurological facts, and probably advancing one of the usual criticisms of the split brain hypothesis and what it means, which is that, well, fine, sure, they're split and they're all these inhibitory connections and so on, but people may not be so comfortable saying more than that, as you were saying at the beginning, like drawing real world consequences of what's purely, in a way, neuroscientific data. But let's not say that there are two brains and two minds and two ways, because that seems hand-waving. I think it's not at all, and probably that's a foundational stone of your whole argument. I think it would be very useful for everybody to realize, and for us to explain, for you to explain us that, yes, there has been some pop psychological understanding of it, and you're not saying that. You're saying something more precise and more potent in a way. So it's a good time perhaps for you to explain that, if you may.
Yes, that's a good idea. I think it's got passed into popular culture that the idea of differences between the brain hemispheres is somehow an exploded idea that carries no scientific credibility. And that's because after the first split brain operations were carried out in the 1960s and 70s in California, the remarkable operations, we were able to study the phenomenology of one isolated hemisphere at a time and see what it is like. And it was discovered that indeed the phenomenology of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are in fact very different. The fact that we're not aware of that is because evolution has taken care to hide it from us. If we were aware that we're kind of fusing two quite different visions of the world all the time, we wouldn't be able to do anything. We would be completely incapable of action. But the fact that there were some very simple-minded deductions made in the early days, such as that the left hemisphere is linguistic and rational, and the right hemisphere emotional and artistic. These, they may have vestiges of truth in them, but only vestiges, because the picture is very much more complex than that. And each hemisphere, in fact, deals with everything, including reason and emotion, and including creativity and reason. So the old differences are to be dispensed with. And I think one of the first things I would say to anybody is put out of your mind everything you think you know about the differences between the left and right hemispheres, because they will be wrong. So it is an important distinction to make, and I'm not just following up the old vision. But the question won't go away. There is, at the core of our being, this fascinating division in the brain, and therefore inevitably in the mental world. Why is it there? And what is its nature? And I unpack those ideas in the, whatever it is, 9 chapters, I think, of part 1. And we'll probably look at those in greater detail on another occasion. Yeah.
So here, let me add a kind of a footnote referring to your biography in a way, because I think it's remarkable that what you're putting forth it is a brave endeavor in the sense that you're walking a fine line, right? Because you're emphasizing how the structure of the brain shapes this way of attending the world that we have as individuals and as a society and as a culture and as a civilization, right? But at the same time, you have to be very careful, and you lay it out in the introduction where you explain first the kind of headline differences between the hemispheres, and then the common confusions, because since the publication of the master and his emissary, you've had time to see what people think and what they criticize, right? So you need to walk this fine line by saying, well, yes, I'm drawing a lot of neural data, but I am not saying that mind is just a derivative of brain stuff, and so on and so forth, right? And this is also related to your path as a scholar, right? Where you wanted to study this, which seems this hemisphere difference, which maybe seemed like a worn out idea, but it was actually underexplored. And nevertheless, so you were advised not to do so, as I understand. Nevertheless, you went for it, right? So you see how interesting. I mean, just again, it's a footnote because we'll go back to the content again. But I think as you emphasize context as being something very important, I want to draw attention to the fact of the context as you as a scholar while approaching these ideas, because that's important in the wider picture of things. There are these ideas that either are pushed to the side, and if you want to go and study them, you're usually advised not to do so because that's not career building, but it's in doing that one can make progress. So if you don't mind to tell us a bit more about that path of yours, and we can quickly go back to the content of the book, if you wish.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I all my life really I've been interested in philosophical questions, and in philosophy one is looking at the structure of ideas, putting them in contrast with one another, in connection with one another. And this is in some ways the opposite of what people often think the process of science should be, which is taking things apart and looking at them as separate, discrete facts or data points. And this is so strong that we've lost really the whole purpose of science, which in the end, yes, you have to do a lot of analysis, a lot of taking things apart, but the purpose of doing so is not fulfilled just in doing that process. That's an intermediary step. The whole point of doing that is to be able to use that information to enrich one's understanding and one's picture of the whole. And in fact, I start from a point made by Erwin Schrödinger in the years just after the Second World War, when he was lecturing in Cambridge. Schrödinger, of course, one of the great figures in the development of quantum mechanics in the last century. He said, really, the point of scientific research is only fulfilled in as much as it begins to help us understand the question, who are we? And he's actually quoting Plotinus, a Greek scholar of the 3rd century. And what Plotinus was asking is the question that we seem to have lost sight of, and I think is damagingly lost sight of. We seem to have lost any idea, the remotest idea of who we are and what we're doing here. And it's in an effort to help understand that question that I wrote this book. So it's inevitable that one tries to see the picture in a sense that makes sense as a whole, and also makes sense in the context of a human life. What I found is that a lot of people who are specialists in the field of neurology have gravitated to my ideas, but those who work purely in laboratory science in the neurosciences have tended not to. And I think what we see there is that there is no way in which somebody who is a physician or a surgeon who is actually dealing with real people can ignore the blatant evidence that these two parts of the brain work in different ways and produce different kinds of experience for the individual. Whereas if you are looking at a technical detail distanced by expensive and elaborate machinery in a laboratory, you will neither be thinking in terms of where this fits into the whole picture, and nor will you welcome somebody who comes along and says, actually, this has human meaning. So that is the conflict, I think. But I'm so convinced that there is meaning here. This was apparent to me 20 or 30 years ago and was enough at that stage. I knew very much less than I do now, but I could also already see certain important connections. And it was that led me to be audacious enough to disregard the kind and very well-meant advice of my mentors and older colleagues, which was to not touch this question of hemisphere difference with a barge pole because it would be career destroying. Somehow I have a perverse desire to face certain risks if they seem important and central enough. And I just want to, before I finish on this, I just want to pick up something you said there, which was that I don't suggest that the mind is purely an emanation of the brain. We'll come on to that very much later in other talks, I hope. But what at least one can say is that the way in which we think, our mental world, is to some extent shaped by the brain. It may not be caused by the brain, but it is nonetheless formed by the brain. It has to come via the brain, and that leaves impression on our sense of the world.
Lovely. And actually this fits back into your fine line walking between truth as something that's out there, unattainable, or something that doesn't exist, and putting it more towards a path to truth. And you are doing the same with reality, which is what I wanted to ask you next. So you have in the introduction these acronyms, right, for the two views of conceiving reality out there, R-O-T. I don't know if in English that should be pronounced rot. And then you have the made up miraculously by ourselves, the mambo version. And of course, again, you are in the virtuous middle, right? And particularly, there's this quote of yours, which I would ask you to unpack, which I think can help at least me, because that's something I care a lot, to understand to what extent, as you said, you're not saying the world is nothing of us, nor it just made up entirely by us. And you're right, quote, "It is true that we can see the world only partially, but we still each see the world directly." And I think this is, very important, especially, I mean, this is an important problem always, but especially today, where, as you know, there are these tides of thinking, both in pop philosophy and science, but also injecting in the real people of the real world, where we're told and hammered that the world is just a hallucination, that everything we perceive, it's kind of the matrix all the time, but it's a matrix where even if you escape from the matrix, you would still doubt that you're still in a simulation again. Now, having somebody write like you, that we see the world directly, which is something I believe as well, I think it's a very strong claim, and sometimes can be just be there modestly in a paragraph, I think it's essential. So if you could also help us understand your position with respect to idealism, and in what sense we have direct access to the world, which goes back to apprehending and comprehending, I think. And also you emphasize representation or representing versus the world as presented to us without kind of a second-hand dealer that hands it in. Yeah.
Yes, and indeed, even more more striking is if one expresses it using a neologism, which has come into philosophical language from the German of Heidegger, the idea of something presencing, which is slightly different from being is present, because is present sounds passive, as though the thing just is manipulated, whereas presencing is something active, and I believe that the world actively engages with our consciousness, which is also actively engaging with it. The idea that it's all a hallucination or a projection on an internal screen is completely understandable, but I think deeply mistaken. It's completely understandable in this sense. If the left hemisphere, which only sees the representation of the world, were to try and explain what is going on, this is exactly the picture it would come up with. The idea of a homunculus sitting inside the brain, watching a screen in a chamber that has no windows on the world, and that this is what we take for reality. First of all, I think it would be remarkable if this were the case, if there were as much agreement between us as to what is going on in the world as there is. We mustn't emphasize, it is certainly true that we can be deceived in what we find in the world, and some people see the world in a very strange way, and this is often the case with people that we talk about as having a mental illness, hallucinating. But although that is a reality, the fact is that there is an extraordinary commonality in the ways in which we find the world to be. What I try to explain is that it is something like the way in which we appreciate a work of art, and perhaps particularly helpful is a piece of music. So take the example of Mozart's G minor quintet. This is not something that just exists in my mind, and it's not just something that exists in Mozart's mind, but it doesn't actually exist on the page in the score either. It exists every time it is played or listened to. It comes into being again in the minds of the players and the listeners. And this gives a rather good way of understanding what I'm trying to get at, that it's neither something that we just make up for ourselves miraculously, nor is it something that is out there objectively, and there is a real G minor quintet of Mozart that is the ideal performance, and that's what we're trying to get at all the time, but failing to do so. Instead, I would suggest that there is an encounter, and that experience is an encounter. I think this is a very, very important idea. And in an encounter, there are two elements, the encounterer and the encountered, but they are joined in a way. They're not, again, atomistically separate. In this act of encounter, they come together to create something. So to an extent, it's always been newly created, that quintet. But in essence, it's always recognizably the same thing. We can all talk about it and have very similar thoughts about it. That's probably the quickest and simplest way in which I convey it. So what I want to emphasize is that when we see the world, it is only indeed an imperfect vision. That, of course, I agree with. But the difference is not that it's imperfect because it is purely a representation of something we can never know. It's only imperfect in the sense that it is partial. And I make the comparison with a wonderful Zen garden, Ryoenji, in Japan, in which there are 15 rocks in this Zen garden, but from any one place in the garden, you can only see at the most 14. You can never see the full picture. And our lives are like that. We see parts, but we do actually see it. What we see is not a hallucination.
Yes, thank you. Well, this is very difficult to unpack in a few minutes, and I'm sure we'll go back to it many times, because, well, that has to do with the process relational view of the universe that I think you and I share.
Exactly.
And this is very difficult, but also very important to try to spell out. Wonderful. Let me now go back, because as you're saying, well, and a smile came out of your face and mine, like when a neuroscientist, let's say, is trying to justify or even claim, demonstrate that the world is nothing but a kind of hallucination. In doing that, we have this sweet paradox where it's, if we can speak like that, a hemisphere of the neuroscientist, again, making a claim about the whole of reality. So this brings us back to these two modes and the asymmetry between them, and in a way, the irreversibility, in the sense that it seems very difficult, if not impossible, to just, especially the left one, realizing that the right one has a different view of the world, right? And so, but you're proposing here an integration. So in a way, you're writing about both hemispheres, and you're giving us all this important detail and analysis. So in a way, you're using one mode, but then you always need to have the master in its proper place, right? To go back to the title of your previous book, right? So in a way, so I'm saying this in order to ask you, what's the way out? Because it seems to me that if you fall into one mode of thinking, you can make amazing discoveries and say a lot of things, but in a way you're not going to get out of it alone, because that's the very nature of being in that mode of thinking and seeing the world, that you cannot go from, again, the parts to the whole. You cannot go from all these isms, all these concepts you were enumerating at the beginning. So it feels like a bit of bootstrapping is needed, or like a little miracle, so that when we are trapped in it, the balance, the proper balance, can come back to it. And I know you don't offer solutions, because that would be perhaps, again, a left brain way of thinking about it, but you do offer a view that perhaps can help us see how do we get out of this hole that we are digging ourselves. And I think that's very important also for civilization writ large.
Well, yes, because as you know, in that earlier book, and to an extent in this book, I make a case that our current thinking is dominated by this serial analytic reductionist process, which is characteristic of the left hemisphere. And actually, many of the great problems that we face, including the destruction of the natural world and the destruction of our own civilization, which are both going on apace, can be traced to this way of looking at the world, which I believe is deeply related. Of course, it's not a matter that is susceptible of proof in its nature. It's not just that I can't prove it, it's that it can't be proven. One of the first paradoxes is that if you view everything that is in the mind as a hallucination, then of course your view that everything in the mind is a hallucination is also your personal hallucination. And there is no way out of this particular box. But I offer a way from experience in two respects. One is to take the reader on a journey in part one of the book that I think for anyone who is not actually a neuropsychiatrist or a clinical neuropsychologist will be a remarkable eye-opener, and even perhaps for such people. I'm looking at actually what does happen to human beings when they start to rely purely or mainly on either the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere alone. And the other way in which I think I can say I offer a pragmatic way of approaching it is that we if we want to evaluate two particular points of view, one of the ways to do so would be to test it against experience. Suppose I adopt a certain theory about humanity and I act in that way. Do I find that I'm constantly surprised, mistaken, or taken aback by the consequences of my doing so? Or do things tend to fit with that vision of the world? And this is a point that has been made in respect of the so-called pragmatist tradition in philosophy, that of C.S. Peirce, John Dewey, and William James, for example, in which, and I think a very rich one, in which the ideas of philosophy are not simply thought about in a very abstract way, which would be a very left hemisphere biased way, but are tested out on experience. And what I find is that the vision of the world that the right hemisphere offers us makes sense to us and doesn't betray us to the degree that it would be that the left hemisphere's view of the world would betray us. One way of thinking about this is like, suppose you have a couple of banks of instruments and you're flying a plane and you can't actually see, so you're relying very much on the electronics at the moment. And you're told that there isn't enough power to run both of these ways of getting information about where you are. Which bank of instruments is more important to you? Surely the one that minimizes the likelihood of your crashing the plane. And what I suggest is that if you adopt the right hemisphere's way of looking at the world, you're not likely to crash the plane. Whereas if you adopt the left hemisphere's view of the world, you do crash the plane. And in a way, that's what I've just referred to, the destruction that's going on all around us as we think about the world in this deeply fallacious way.
Yes, and as the plane is crashing, the left hemisphere would insist of bringing forth their own solutions in order to fix the problem it itself has been causing, right? So again, this is kind of the self-circular nature of the problem. And so maybe
particularly, I may say so just particularly the way of the left hemisphere, which is self-referential, because it can't break out, as it were, into reality. It's dealing all the time with its map. And it's saying, yes, but the map says, and it is therefore in denial about what is happening. And this is rather like, I've experienced this a couple of times, and people tell me about this happening to them, that they're navigating in a car using a sat-nav, and their passenger is saying, well, the sat-nav says we're there, but you look out of the window and say, we're not there at all, we're in another place. You must be wrong. No, well, the sat-nav says.
Yes.
And that is really the left hemisphere. It says, well, the sat-nav says. It doesn't look out of the window, and it's trying to get people to look out of the window that I'm aiming to do in this book.
Exactly.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's perfect, because this is also a way to summarize it would be, yes, trust your abstractions, but cherish your own experience, which is a big caveat, both for academics, but also, I don't know, probably the real world people too, including us, of course. But there's again this trend of thinking that insists that, well, we need to doubt, which is a healthy skepticism. Sure, but if we doubt to the point where nothing of what I can experience can bring forth any weight on me deciding what's going on in the world, and I just outsource this more and more to abstractions, my abstractions or some abstractions that I borrow, I think we end up in this situation where we are in the middle of nowhere, but the GPS says we arrived at the place, and we can find a way to just, well, maybe if I step out of the car and look around, I realize that we've made a mistake, and that's fine. We can correct it. It's fine to correct the mistake. Okay, in wrapping up, unless you want to add something on this, because I want to start wrapping, because we're not in a hurry.
No, well, what we haven't, of course, endeavored to do, and perhaps can't in one go, is to paint some of the differences between the two hemispheres. As I say, I'm not sure that can be done just like that now. But one of them that's very relevant is the left hemisphere's capacity for denial and for false optimism. So the left hemisphere, as far as it's concerned, there is never a problem because it's always in control, and it's always right. It's actually physically will look at a paralyzed limb and say it's not paralyzed. So somebody after a right hemisphere stroke relying only on their left hemisphere may have a completely paralyzed left half of the body, but their functioning left hemisphere will say, but it's functioning fine. So this is what we're up against.
Yes, and I must admit that when I read those chapters, I was literally mind blown, and I couldn't believe really what can go wrong with their own minds. And it read like science fiction, but it wasn't science fiction, it was neurology. And maybe just for our listeners, because now we're saying, well, the left hemisphere says or thinks the right, but I promise, I can make the promise because it has been fulfilled for me as I was reading your book, that as we move through the detailed evidence and also its significance, it would be clear this is not just and I maybe I shouldn't just say just, but this is not a philosophical position only. This is really what you get exactly as you see what actually happens when the left or the right part of the brain is screwed up, and from here it's from where you're drawing these statements that it is in denial and so on, which brings us back to the fact that we are trapped and maybe into its ways forward to untrap ourselves, which is where I think the book that you've written over the last 10 years, which with nearly 2,000 pages, 1,600 pages and hundreds of references. Well, I think this is the major contribution beyond science and philosophy. It's to show a path, and it's not just an argument, as you say in the very first line of the book. It's not just it is an argument, but it's not just an argument. It's a journey that hopefully while we finish it, or as we're walking through that journey, we may realize that there are these ways of looking that we are not enjoying so much as we could. So maybe this is also to put it in a more positive note. It's not just a battle between bad ways and good ways, but it's also a joyful journey. That I think that's also part of what's going to happen, right? As we go through the means to truth or the portals to truth, which is part 1, and the paths to truth, which is part 2, and part 3, and so on, is that we're going to walk through attention, perception, judgment, science, reason, imagination, and consciousness, matter, time, space, the sacred. And it's going to be a joyful trip. And I think that's a good mark that we're doing something good enough or right or true, that there's this joy in reading it. It's not like reading philosophy or science when it is presented as a mathematical theorem. You must obey and walk through that path, but it's both an argument and an offering, if you allow me to say that. And I think this is fascinating, and I'm grateful that you wrote it in this way.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. Yes, I think that is a good point. In a way, what I'm suggesting is that the sort of questions we want to answer are not susceptible of resolution by purely rational argument, not by mine or anyone else's. I do offer arguments as we go through that I hope are persuasive, but the most persuasive thing, if you're trying to get somebody to see the world a different way, is not just to sit in a seminar room and argue about it, but it's to go out into the world and have a look. And this is how empirical science works, and it's also how a kind of empirical philosophy works. And what I reckon is that if you accompany me, as you have, on this trip and look at the evidence of what happens to human beings when they're forced to rely on one way of thinking at the expense of another, it demonstrates. I mean, I can't help you if you don't see what I see, and that's fair enough. But for those who want to see, I believe I show that one of these views of the world is more reliable than the other. Importantly, that doesn't mean that the other way of looking, the left hemisphere way of looking, is wrong. It's just limited. It's very limited, and it's limited with a purpose in mind, to enable us to grab stuff. And that's not nothing. We won't live if we can't eat and build shelter and so on. But that is not the tool whereby we come to understand the world. To do that, we need to bring many strands from experience, from intuition, from science, from reason together. And people who don't do that actually have a fairly common mental illness. What is remarkable is that schizophrenia is really an example of what happens to people who have to rationalize about everything. They can't start from any bed of experience at all. And it's a point not just made by me, but made by others before me, that when people are schizophrenic, it's not that they have lost their reason, as we say in English. I don't know if one does in Spanish, say that a mad person has lost his reason. It's not just that, but that they have lost everything but their reason, and they have to argue for and deduce things, as it were, theoretically, that most of us do intuitively from a grounding in the real world. So it's a very interesting.
Yes, you see how language serves to both show and also conceal, because it's saying the opposite. And it's a nice trick. Well, one more thing to add, because you prompted me this thought where you mentioned it's not just about rational argument. And that's where many people become very nervous, right? Because it seems that rational argument, like this sort of rationality, is not just a good instrument, which of course it is, but it's the only instrument allowed. And now when you do this synthesis, because that's also what you propose, and also these conversions, because it's not just a synthesis from one realm, but a convergence synthesis, and you make explicit where it starts to become difficult, I would guess, to articulate, because the moment you start talking about what's supra-rational or what's not only rational, maybe beyond rational, including it, right? That's the beauty of it. It's not rejecting it, of course, including it. And intuition and imagination. I think, Iain, what you're doing is you're going, if I may say so, and many people may not feel comfortable with this either, but it's like going a bit forward in human evolution. It's like, well, as a species, and our human mind has excelled, no doubt, with reason and with many other abilities, you may say. But the moment we start to talk more openly and precisely and accurately about imagination and intuition, I think we're in a new path. Well, it's a well-trodden path, but it's a good path because we're making progress. We are not always all around congratulating ourselves as to, how enlightened we could be, but we are also acknowledging that there is something else. And perhaps that's also why you have this amazing book. Book, it's a chapter, but that's something that happens with your chapters, that they could all be books by themselves, where you talk about consciousness, which is one of my favorite chapters, but also the sacred at the very end. So here we have somebody that's very knowledgeable in neurology and physics and philosophy, and at the end is writing about the sacred, and this should not scare academics or real world people, and they should excite, or at least make them feel grateful for a chapter on the sacred, right? But you see how we are not just walking the fine line, as I was telling you before, but also getting into a point where it's a kind of an edge. There's this mist, and you start not to see with the accuracy of the data of mathematical theorem demonstration, but you're in this place where, to be honest, is where I think we need to go, and we should not be scared. I think we should enjoy it, and you're going into that place, and I think that's also remarkable.
Yes, thank you. Well, what I wanted in this book was to show the confluence that I see between findings in neurology, trends in the last 100 years in philosophy, and findings in physics. I'm not a physicist, Alex, as you are, but I do. I have, rather to my surprise, I found myself being approached by quite a number of physicists who'd read The Master and His Hemisphere and said this is incredibly relevant to what we are dealing with. And so I do have people that I can try out my ideas on before I write them. But in any case, the point is that these apparently, to our way of thinking, quite distinct paths, that of neuropsychology, that of philosophy, and that of physics, come together. And it's like starting from points on the circumference of a circle and going inwards and coming together. And what is also interesting to me is that the picture that coheres there is also recognizable in the great ancient traditions of philosophy around the world. It agrees with the findings of ancient wisdom traditions. Hence, the idea that we can just not say anything about the idea of value, like goodness, beauty, truth, all of the sacred. Scientists and philosophers better keep off those things. I mean, that is not the way it is for me. And what I hope is that people might start out this book, I don't know, some of them, rather thinking, well, he's got a difficult furrow to plough if he's going to convince me that it's worth talking about these subjects. But I hope that after following me through the book, if they have the patience and courage to do so, they will find that it's absolutely essential, and that in a way, only somebody who was rather blinkered would think, no, you can't bring these into the picture. They are at the core of the picture.
Yes, indeed. So, we are there in the car, the GPS, we're not sure if it's working. We can look through the window and we can ask the indigenous people around. And if now the GPS and your site and your own orientation and what the locals tell you seems to start converging, this is a good sign that we are approaching the place we want to get at, even though we will never really get at it. But in this process, we're getting closer. Beautiful.
I love that. That's a very nice way of putting it. Thank you.
Well, just for me to add, I hope this suffices as a good enough invitation for anyone to read your book, and we will continue, hopefully, unpacking it, enjoying it. It's again, for me, it's an honor to do so with you, Iain.
Well, it is a hugely important experience for me to have somebody with your breadth of background responding so positively to it. And I hope that we will actually make this journey together and bring some listeners and viewers with us on that path.
Great. So let's leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Goodbye for now then, Àlex.
Yes. See you soon.
Till next time. Okay.